Now we're going to talk about what happens when you have a quadratic that does not touch the x-axis. What happens is it has no real solution, but it has something that's called an imaginary solution or a complex root. So that's what this section is going to be about. All right, so the first thing you have to understand how to do is how to simplify these numbers. This is on page 52 in your workbook. Basically, something you need to know and probably write down is that I stands for the square root of -1. I squared then is the square root of -1 squared, which is -1. And these two things you have to know in order to be successful in this section. So if you look here, they say that r could be some number. So in this case, they're making r 3. So they say the way that you break down the square root of -3 is to look at it as the square root of -1 times the square root of 3. And then square root of -1 we replace with an I. And so that's why the I is out front and then the square root of 3. And then the second one, it just says that you can always square this. So you would do I squared, which is I squared, times the square root of 3 squared. Now the square root of 3 squared, the square and the square root cancel out, and that's why they left you with that it was 3. So in that case, if I squared is -1, then it would be -1 times 3, which is how they got -3. All right, so here's a couple other examples. I would want you to look at this as -1 times the square root of 49, like that. And then we just learned that the square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 49 is 7. So since it comes out as a whole number, we're actually going to write that as 7I. Doesn't look too good. So the same way with this one, it'll be square root of -1 times the square root of 4. That would be I, and then the square root of 4 is 2, so it'll be 2I. Right now for this one, you got to break down the square root of 45 and take out the I, so it would be like square root of -1 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 5. Now when you break this down, this part would be I, this would be 3, and this would stay square root of 5. So the answer would be 3I. Oops, square root of 5. Okay, now with addition and subtraction, this is going to be on page 53. It's very easy. You're really just adding like terms. So I have, like it says up here, you add A and C, and you add BI and DI because they are like terms. Right, so the way this would look is you take -8, -1, that'd be -9. And then 3I and -2I would be plus 1I. So that would be your imaginary term. Okay, the same way with subtraction. The only thing though is I would change this to addition and then distribute the negative, only because I've seen over the years that students will forget to subtract to the second term. So I'm just going to have you change it to an addition problem. So 36 and -12 would be 24. And then you'd have -3I and -24I would be -27. And again, that would be your imaginary term. All right, down here this is addition, so I'm just going to add these two and I get 0. And then I and -8I would be -7I. So your final answer to that would be -7I. All right, same thing in number 12 as we did in 10. As soon as I see the subtraction, I say, no, let me change it to addition and just distribute the negative. So that would be +6 and then a +6I. So now I'm going to take -5 and 6 would be 1, and -5I and 6I would be +1I. So that's how that answer would look. Notice how the number comes first and then the I term. That's standard form. Okay, and then the same thing works for multiplication. So basically this is going to be a full problem. So we distribute the first term. That would be -15 negative 15 and then plus negative 1 times negative I is positive I. Now we're going to do the non-I times 15, distribute that to everything. And let's do that part in black. So that would be, let's see, 15 times 9 would be 135. I, because it's non-I times 15. And then non-I times negative I is negative 9I squared, because it's I times I. I times I would be I squared. Okay, so now the difference with this one is that we already talked about how I squared stands for negative 1. So now I'm going to look at this last term as negative 9 times negative 1, and I'm going to call that positive 9. So now I'm looking at negative 15 and adding it with 9. So it'll be negative 6. And now I can take my like term of I and 135I, which should be 136. So that should be your final answer for that one. Okay, so let's actually try this other one here. So we're going to take 13 and distribute it. And that gives me 169 for 13 times 13, and 13 times negative 1 will be negative 13I. Then we have I times 13 is going to be a positive 13. And I times negative I is going to be negative I squared. So if we look at that, it's going to be negative 1 times, that's the negative 1 right there, and I squared is also negative 1, which would make that a plus 1. So I'm going to take 169 plus 1 would be 170, and then the two pieces in the middle cancel out. So this answer actually ends up just being 170. All right, and now let's actually start solving these now that we can. If you don't like the 0 on this side, you can always put it on the other side. It doesn't matter. You can flip-flop these two things. And my objective is to get this x squared by itself. So I'm going to subtract 25 to both sides. So I have 5x squared is equal to negative 25. Now I'm going to divide by 5. Again, I have to get that x squared by itself before I can do any work. Negative 25 divided by 5 is negative 5. Now when I square root both sides here, I'm going to have x equals positive negative. And remember, we have to simplify that. So I'm going to think about it as square root of negative 1 times square root of 5. So this I comes out, and then square root of 5 stays. So my answer looks like that. All right. Now for the next one, same thing, we rewrite it first. Okay, so I'm going to add 10 to both sides. That'll be x squared equals negative 8. Now that my x squared is isolated, I can square root both sides. So x is going to be, let's think about this as square root of negative 1 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. I'm just breaking down 8 into a perfect square. So this will give me I, this will give me 2. So it'll be positive and negative, because I took the square root of both sides, 2I square root of 2. That's what your answer, final answer would be.